Hello everybody, and welcome to my first drawing chat of this channel. It'll probably be a little rough around the edges because I'm still getting the hang of things here. Anyway, this is going to be a commentary of the drawing process of drawing a comic book page. It's one of the pages, or more specifically half of one of the pages of my webcomic called Mindfold, which I update whenever I get the chance between regular jobs. There's some links down below for where the comic can be read in its entirety if you're into such things. So what we have in front of us now is a gang up of the most recent part of the story. I like to put all the pages up, all the completed pages up, as a sort of immediate shotgun blast of just where the story has been, and also where the color schemes of previous pages has gone. Generally, when I go from scene to scene, I like to keep a consistent color family going throughout that scene. So we're going to start with the bottommost page of that gang up, which is just laid out at this point. It's just sort of very quick blobs that show what goes on that part of the page, what goes in each panel, and kind of where the narrative is going to go. And what I've done now is I've put another layer in Photoshop at partial transparency, which is almost like tracing paper, where I'm going to start taking those very rough blobs and start to work out the actual detail of what's going on. Because even though I know kind of what goes in each panel and where it goes, there's going to be a lot of reworking of how I want that to actually carry the story, and obviously to work out the actual, make it into real drawings and work out all the details. And right now I'm glancing at references that are on another monitor. I like to keep my references a little bit out of sight because I don't want to make a really literal copy of my references. I just want to use them to make sure I'm getting things generally in the right ballpark, and especially things like this. This is the main character yawning because she's just waking up. I prefer to have some real world reference of what someone's face looks like when it's really distorted in that kind of a yawn. I feel like the more I work with references, the more I learn about the real world, rather than just kind of guessing based on what I think is reality. And I'm using a 6 pixel hard round brush with some texture applied, so it looks a little bit like a pencil. This is all done in Photoshop, but I really cut my teeth in using just physical media or traditional media. So I like things to look, at least in my layout phase, I like things to look a little bit like pencil or charcoal. That just sort of is my comfort zone. But definitely, if you prefer to work with, just big fields of color, or however you want to do it, it's all legitimate. It's all good. And you can see in the second panel, I've started to change it quite a bit. Originally, the character was sort of more in a state of shock that when she discovers her arm, because previously in the story she'd lost her arm, and now some doctors have repaired and replaced that lost arm. And I decided that it shouldn't really be like a shock, like she's just learned that she's lost her whole family or something. It should just be more of a sort of bafflement, or trying to figure out how this happened. So I've tried to take a little of the melodrama out and make it more of a contemplative pose, and make the yeah, make her body language a little bit less melodramatic. And again, even though I have reference that I'm working from, which is mostly photographs of me just holding my arms up in different lighting conditions, I'm exaggerating and kind of caricaturing a lot of what I'm doing. I feel that the experience of looking at a real person in the real world is radically different from a camera interpreting just the physical light and shadow patterns of an object. There's a lot of life and gesture that the human eye is interpreting, and I like to try to emulate that emotional experience and the experience of a figure that's moving in time, and we just happen to get a little momentary glimpse of that figure in motion, rather than photograph, which is just, it's frozen in time, and that emotional content is lost. I feel that if you really, essentially trace your reference, it's just going to suck all the life out of the subject. And especially like with hands and faces, if you trace your hand reference, it's almost always going to look more like a mannequin hand or a crumpled up leather glove, rather than something that's moving and living and moving dynamically through space. So I think really almost like I consider my portraits to be more like caricatures, even if they look quite classic in their proportions. It's still a lot more exaggerated. Like, I can pretty much guarantee, like in the photo reference, her eyebrows are probably not quite as crumpled up as they are in the drawing, and her lips are probably not quite as full, and the eyelids are not quite as droopy. It's all just taken a little bit further than what you'd actually see in reality, and I think that's important. If you look at like some of the titans of portraiture, like John Singer Sargent or something. I've seen a lot of John Singer Sargent's paintings like up close and in person, and it seems pretty obvious to me that he's really more interested in the indication and the gesture of it, rather than trying to get like a faithful emulation of what a photograph would do. And I would definitely consider John Singer Sargent to be kind of like someone to emulate and aspire to, even though I'll never get to his level of greatness. And I like to think of it in a similar way, like I'm putting up my interpretation of the figure rather than getting too hung up on precision. And on the subject of really having these panels convey more of an emotional content rather than just a faithful representation of reality, you can see my original layout was a very confrontational pose, like she's defying something with that wide-legged, very straightforward stance, and I've changed it to a much more kind of classical Renaissance counterpoint pose, where the hips and shoulders are cocked in opposite angles, and I'll gradually distort that figure so it becomes even more of a kind of elegant pose rather than such an aggressive one. You can see me tilting the shoulders there, and I'll probably do a similar thing to the hips at some point. Again, because I'm trying to create an emotional landscape that's a little bit more mellow and like she's contemplating her world rather than confronting it. And you can see now I'm laying in my lighting, and the figure is standing in front of a brightly lit window, so if I were to go for the real drama, I would probably have the figure almost like a silhouette, and you just see this rim light of the light coming in from the window. But again, I wanted to create a little bit more of a a mood of contemplation, and I added a lot of side light there, so there's a lot more elegant modeling of the figure with those lots of things going on in the light and shadow, and here also, this is another thing where I'm deviating from my reference, where my photo reference, those arms are kind of tilted away from the viewer, so you get a lot of foreshortening. The forearms in the photograph look shorter than the upper arms because they're tilting away in space, but in the drawing, that doesn't always really work that well. Like a viewer will look at a photograph and think, oh, that's reality. You know, they understand that the photograph is portraying space, and they'll accept it. But if people look at a drawing and see that silhouette of, especially like the arm on the right side, they're going to think, no, that something looks weird there. Like, why is that arm deformed like that? So I have to cheat my reference and make a concession to the fact that the eye does not interpret a drawing the same way that the eye interprets a photograph. And I see a lot of people make that mistake of making like a very faithful representation of the photograph and say, well, that's the way the photograph did it, so it must be right. But in fact, a lot of times when drawing, I find that I'm cheating a lot, and I'm deliberately faking reality, whether it's the human figure or drawing perspective or lights and shadows. Like, I believe it's the job of the artist to really interpret a lot of the photograph and interpret the reality rather than just trying to copy. And on that subject, this is the Linework now. I've switched from Photoshop into Manga Studio because I think the pen tools in that software are very nice at creating a gesture. It's not quite as industrial as Photoshop is, and the Linework is definitely a convention or a vernacular that's unique to Western drawing. It's not reality. We all know that objects in the real world don't have a black outline, but everyone looks at that and thinks, yeah, that's reality, that's acceptable. So you know, this is definitely a case of interpreting reality, and as such, it needs to work more as a drawing than as an accurate portrait, and the gesture of those lines becomes very important. That really gives the presence of the artist, as it's the drawing becomes an expression of the creative act where you can really see those gestures adding life to the drawing. And you'll see that the first two panels here, they have line work because they're more of a straightforward drawing. The third panel does not get line work because it's going to be more about light and shadow, so that hard line is going to conflict with the very subtle renderings of light and shadow. And right now I'm back in Photoshop. I've imported my line work into Photoshop as a separate layer. The blend mode is set to multiply. I'm going to start laying in color now, and like I said at the beginning, I like to have a consistent color family in each scene, and I want to make sure that my color is coming, or the way I'm going to make that consistent is I'm going to make sure that my color is coming from the same source. And I'm going to just take a photograph. This is a totally random photograph of a Buddhist temple that I found on the internet, but I like the color balance, the way that there's a lot of red and that sort of pinkish light that's coming in through the windows is illuminating this scene. That's the quality, that's the atmosphere that I want on this page. So I'm just sampling that photograph and completely obliterating the content of the photograph, just taking color from the same source and using that to color in my background. And that accomplishes two things. One, my color is consistent, and two, most importantly, I'm sampling colors from nature. These are all, colors that I would never have come up with on my own, and to me that's like very important in a drawing. I want to always work from nature. I want to pull information from nature, and I want to create a sense of the unexpected and find colors that I never would have thought of on my own, that are just coming from this photograph. And excuse me, just adding a little bit more chaos to the drawing. So what I'm doing here is there is a bas-relief frieze in this room. You can see the entire artwork right there. I drew out this flat image of the wall decorations, and since this wall decoration is appearing in multiple panels of this scene, I figured I might as well just draw the whole thing and then just sample bits of it as I go along. That way I don't need to redraw the whole thing over and over again. I can just make sure that it all comes from the same source. It saves time, and it makes sure that that background decoration is always consistent. And what I also did there is I created silhouettes. You can see that sort of flesh-colored silhouette that's of the figure itself, and that's where I'm going to start adding all of my color, light and shadow. And you can see there I've taken my initial pencil under drawing and dropped it on top of those silhouettes, and it's not on a separate layer. It's been blended into that flesh-colored silhouette, and I'm starting to add all my light and shadow information now. And as I'm doing this, I'm actually obliterating my underdrawing. It's not on separate layers. I tend to like to work on as few layers as possible. I want that effect of painting over an existing color, and that way what I'm painting becomes slightly influenced by what's underneath it. Every pixel there is not completely opaque. The opacity setting of my brush is somewhere around like 35%, so every pixel is being influenced by what's underneath it. There's a mixture of color happening, and that helps serve the purpose that I was talking about earlier, which is I'm creating chaos. I'm creating unexpected colors that I would not have mixed on my own, and I find that when the human eye sees a lot of color variation and sees a little bit of texture and a little bit of chaos, the viewer will say, yeah, that looks real. If it's too flat, if the colors are too similar, it's going to start looking dead, and people are just going to say, oh, that looks too fake, and it breaks that sort of what we expect to see in reality. We expect to see a lot of noise and a lot of chaos in reality, and I try to keep that sense of the unexpected as I'm doing all of this rendering here. Right now I'm just adding light and shadow. There's no sense of local hue yet. This particular character is European, so she's going to have like a European flesh color right now. It's just that sort of yellow ochre umber color, and I'm going to start adding local color using a 60 pixel or a 300 pixel airbrush set to multiply mode, and you can see that happening here. I've got more of a pink color, and I'm very lightly adding a transparent glaze. I mean, it's Photoshop, it's not oil paint, so it's not really a glaze, but that's kind of the effect that I'm going for, to just start tinting that yellow ochre into more of a pinky flesh kind of color. And at this point, I'm going back and forth and either modeling light and shadow or adding bits of local hue. I'm not going to bore you with the entire rendering process, because at this point it's just a lot of noodling of small details, like especially on backs. There's just a lot of muscle and bone interactions that just take a long time to render. And if I showed the whole recording of that, this video would go on forever. So at some point I'm gonna skip to the final result and start working on the other panels. Another thing that you'll notice throughout the rendering process, both of the figure and of pretty much all of the elements, is there's some areas like the back part of the knees there where there's some very sharp edges. Oh, you can see now, I've skipped ahead, you can see that I've added a lot more local hue and a lot more bright lights on that figure. Like I said earlier, I wanted that very like blown out look to the light to really give a sense of that the bright light coming in from the window that's being added to by these bright lights on the side of the figure. But you can see now in the first panel there, I'm starting to lay in some very sharp strokes. I want some of my strokes to have very hard and crisp edges, especially like around the wrinkles and around any area where a surface is transitioning from tilting from one plane into the other. I want a sharp transition. So like around the hand wrinkles, around the wrinkles, around where she's yawning. And then I'm going to go back in with a soft round brush or even an airbrush, and I'm going to smooth out part of those edges. What I'm really striving for is having smooth transitions and sharp transitions all within the same object. I find that, again, that gives the nicest illusion of reality. The eye sees a combination of hard and soft transitions and thinks, yeah, that looks like reality. Like you can see now I'm blending in, I'm keeping the sharp angles of part of those wrinkles, but I'm smoothing out the opposite edge. And that's just sort of a super quick and dirty cheat of tricking my viewers into thinking that that I'm emulating reality. I mean, reality is much more complex than that, but this is just a shorthand in sort of faking the effect of what happens in reality. And there's parts of this drawing where I sort of got carried away, like those wrinkles in the face. Those are, I love drawing those kind of details, like how the flesh distorts in extreme facial expressions. And I probably added a little bit too much information there. It starts to conflict with just telling the story, and I'll go back in and edit some of that out. A lot of my drawing style is really, I add too much information and then I start to take it away again. And when I overpaint all of my details, my brush is not set at complete opacity, so I'm creating, like I mentioned earlier, that layered effect. Like each pixel is influenced not just by the color I'm laying down, but it's being influenced by what happened before, what's happening underneath it. So even though I have a lot of those, those teeth and nostrils and wrinkles and stuff all laid out, I'm gonna go back in and sort of obscure those with a very, very light airbrush, usually like a 300 pixel airbrush, and kind of mellow out some of that that harshness, just because even though all that stuff is going on, if you get too crazy trying to put every detail in there, it's just going to start to become confusing. It's going to start to become an exercise in making a very complicated drawing, but not necessarily telling a good story. And since this is a comic book, the primary objective here is to give the viewer like an immediate emotional impact and not get too carried away with all of the details. And you can see now I've skipped ahead. I've added all of that local color. I've added or I've subtracted quite a bit of detail and sort of made it more of a direct impact. What I'm doing here is I'm adding in the background. This is a bas-relief, so those are not fully sculpted shapes and forms. They're just sort of like slightly raised out of their background. So I'm rendering them just with a slight kind of highlight, but not as if there's not going to be like harsh cast shadows and a lot of very complicated modeling. The other thing about that background is that it's being illuminated in a diffuse and very ambient manner. There's no direct light. Like the figure definitely has a very bright blown out key light and a slight fill light going on, but this background is much more about ambient light, and I do that for two reasons. One, I want to create a more subdued mood for that room, and two, I don't want to have too many crazy lighting effects all going on in the same panel, because that gives me the same problem that I was talking about earlier, which is just if there's too many crazy details and lighting effects in every square millimeter of the panel, it's just going to become very confusing, and it's going to create almost what I would call like a wallpaper effect, where like if there's the same level of detail and emphasis on every part of the drawing, it just becomes like this flat pattern, and it loses any sense of directing the eye to particular areas, and it loses a sense of hierarchy. I would say that every drawing really needs to have a sense of hierarchy of like the hero element in that drawing, and then support elements which can almost fade to no elements at all. Like the upper right part of that second panel, it's almost just this dead brown. Like I don't want the eye to go there, so it just becomes purely atmospheric. And also, just on a technical note, what I'm doing right now with my brush is I'm creating what 3D modelers refer to as ambient occlusion, which is I'm just adding a very smooth and consistent dark shadow where all my crevices are, and that's going to create the illusion of like ambient light just kind of bouncing around the room, and a sense of like cracks and crevices, but without any harsh lights and shadows. It's that the ambient light should be almost as if you're looking at the room on a foggy day, like everything is lit almost equally, and your darkest darks are really happening just where that ambient light is least likely to fall, which is going to be like in the cracks and crevices and sharp corners. And I just got through laying in a little bit of texture to that wall. It's sort of a terracotta stone wall, so I wanted a little bit of that indicated. It was just a photograph of some stone that I took somewhere on some travel somewhere and pulled out of my library. Usually when I travel, I try to I'm sort of probably cut a strange figure, because when I'm traveling, I'll just get very excited about taking lots of photographs of a sidewalk or extreme close-ups of tree bark and stuff, and I have a library of all of those textures that I'll use to drop into illustrations in the way I just did, both to create specific textures in a super fast way, but also to do what I was talking about earlier, which is just to create some chaos. Even if that stone texture, sometimes I'll put like a stone texture on skin or something. I just want that extra little bit of random occurrences to be present there, just because when the eye sees a bit of unpredictable chaos, the viewer just sees that as being more realistic. So I like adding that randomness in there. I'm starting to work on the figure now of the third panel, and I was never really happy with the way that face laid out, so I actually spent a huge amount of time noodling that face to death, and I think there's one point I think where I even just deleted the whole figure and started over from scratch, and I'm gonna spare you watching all of that, all of those changes. As you can see here, I've skipped ahead to the final product. I've done a few things that I want to point out. One is I've started to add my local hues, and I've also added my complete dynamic range of light. So there are some areas of the figure that are completely black and some areas of the figure that are completely white. I usually try to do like one of the last things I do is double check, like, can I find an area on my painting that's completely white, and can I find an area that's completely black? I want a full range of value, just to give that extra sense of punch. So going back to what I was talking about I've added local hue mostly using an airbrush set to multiply mode, which gradually tints what's underneath it. So especially like around the knuckles of the hand, the nose, the cheeks, I've added some pinks, and I've just gradually added very light transparent washes over there to build up those pinks. And the reason that my local hue ended up there is because I find that when an object is lit, when a colored object is lit, the most saturation of color tends to come right in that transitional point, right where the light is transitioning from the brightest lit into the shadowed area where the light is starting to fall off. I find that's where the hues become the most saturated, and also in the shadow area you get more saturated color than you get in the most brightly lit area. So the very brightly lit area of that hand is literally white. Like if I held my color picker over there, it would be like 256, 256, 256, completely white. But in the shaded areas, I get much more of a bright red. So that red is part of my key light, and then you can see at the lower right corner of her chest in that second panel, there's almost a purplish blue color. That's the ambient light of the room that's starting to illuminate the shadow areas, and it's sort of like light that's coming in from the opposite side. If I were building a 3D model in the olden days, I would have to set an actual light source there to emulate that. But in reality, there's no light source to her right. It's just the ambient light of the room that's casting some illumination into those areas. And the ambient light is going to be colored based on the local color of that room. So the room is sort of a cool red, so the light that's hitting the figure from the right is going to be a cooler light than what you would see from that key light coming in through the window. So that's about all that went into this page. I guess this chat was mostly about figure drawing because the figure is really the dominant element of this particular part of the story. In the future, I will do some recordings more of like interior architecture, maybe some exteriors, and just show the different ways of approaching those subjects. I don't know when I'll do them because I just work on this comic whenever I have some downtime. But I hope this episode was helpful to you and gave you maybe a few good ideas of stuff to do in your own artwork. And like I said, there are some links down below if you want to check out the comic itself. And I will talk to you next time. All right, take care, everybody. Bye.